So I actually made the top before I started working on the base, but it made more sense to post the base video first. But to make this top, it's an edge grain butcher block style top, even though true butcher block is end grain lumber. People kind of just say butcher block as a umbrella term nowadays. So I was using construction grade lumber again. I had to get this stuff from Home Depot because my Lowe's doesn't have as nice of a grade of lumber in this category. And these are 2 by 10 by 8s. So they're about 1.5 inches thick by about 9.5 inches wide and 8 feet long. So the tabletop itself is only going to be about 5 feet, and this grade of lumber usually has a lot of checks at the ends. So in order to make my life easier so I wasn't planning a ton of lumber, I went through and cut a little bit, a nice sized chunk off each end, I'd say about 8 inches, just so that they're a little bit shorter and to get rid of all that splits and stuff at the end of the lumber. So these 2 by 10s are actually Douglas fir. I prefer making these style tabletops out of Douglas fir than some of the more standard white wood pine you would find in the DIY type stores, just because the finish of it turns, I think, out much nicer than that white wood, which has a tendency to turn a little more yellow. This Douglas fir has a red hue to it, so it just looks nicer. So once I had that done, I sent all these boards through my planer. You're not taking off a ton of material, but this is construction grade lumber, so it's going to have an uneven surface. And to make these butcher block style tops perfect, it's just like regular lumber. The flatter it is, the easier it is to glue everything up. So you can see I'm still using this short piece of hose on my dust collection, and sometimes it catches and falls off, but it is nice having that dust collection to hook up to this planer. So I only take off about 1/8 of an inch on either side. I send it through till they're smooth on both sides, is basically the process for this. So you're going to end up with boards a little bit thinner than that 1/2 inch. So this process can be a little tedious when you're doing a bunch of boards. I don't remember exactly, but I think I had about 7 boards for this project because I ended up using some of this planed wood to make the table base as well, so I planed it all at once. So my method is usually to just have 2 stacks, and I keep switching back and forth between the stacks to make sure I'm planing the same pieces, and then I flip it usually every other one so that you're getting a nice even surface on both sides. So now I'm using a jointing jig I made for my table saw. It rests on the fence and it makes a rudimentary jointer, which I think works pretty well for the purposes I need it for if you don't have a jointer. I have a video on my channel showing you how to make this, and this is just going to clean up one edge of these 2 by 10s. So the method that this works is you kind of have the saw blade recessed in this melamine face sitting on your table saw, so that the outfeed section is about 1/8 inch thicker than the infeed section. So it's trimming off just like a jointer would about 1/8 of an inch of material, and I send it through on both sides. You can see how far it stretches past the blade. I send it through on both sides until when you're looking at it riding against that white melamine fence, there's no gaps in it. That usually means it's pretty flat. I will check it with a square sometimes on a flat surface to make sure that it's been trued up. So I only do this on one side because I'm going to rip them into strips after that. So you can see when they're all sitting on the stack, and I could see it's 7 boards now, that there's no huge gaps or bows or cups in those boards, which is super important. And this is kind of the before and after of those plain boards. Those 2 pieces are the pieces that weren't planed. You could just see how rough and uneven that surface is and how nice the plain surface of the board is. And then I end up with a little under 1.5 inches by a little less than 9 inches on all of my pieces. So then it's time to rip all these into strips. So this tabletop, since it's cantilevered, I wanted this top to be a little bit thicker. I usually make these standard about 1.5 inches, which is kind of the size of most countertops, but I made this closer to 2 inches so it was a little bit stronger. So I tested out the feather boards I made for attaching to my table saw fence for this, because you want all these cuts to be pretty perfect. And aside from the push stick getting in the way a little bit, those feather boards work really well to hold that material in place. I think I got 4 strips for each piece I had, and it ended up just about perfect, where there was only a little bit of a sliver left of that lumber, so not a lot of waste on this project. So then I just put a clamp on all my pieces to make sure there's not any huge gaps, and there isn't, and you could see holding these up just how nice and flat and perfect these strips turn out. But the important part of this process now is to glue these up immediately. If you let these sit around your shop, they're going to move pretty extremely on you. So I glue these up in pieces nowadays. That was a suggestion on one of my videos a while back, which turns out great. I glue these up in sections so that I can then send the sections through my planer again. So my planer mouth is only about 13.5 inches, and with the width of this table, which was 28 inches, I had to glue it up in 3 sections by like 2 inches. I was off. So it would have been easier to only make 2 sections, but I had to do 3. Once I glue these up, I always add topside cauls with C-clamps to them. I know some people say to just clamp up and down every other clamp and they'll stay flat, but for me, the only way to guarantee that these panels stay flat is using cauls. So those are my 3 sections, and then like I said, I could send my 3 sections through the planer and get these nice and flat. Now, even with the 3 sections, I was still going to be short of that 28 inches by like a sliver. So you could see I'm sending through an extra sliver as well, because I'll have to glue that up with my pieces. I also didn't show this in the video, but before I glue up all these sections, I do pick the nicer side to all the pieces. So I try and keep most of the knots on the bottom because it's pine, so you don't want to have to worry about them oozing sap over time, which they will, or releasing tannins and kind of staining the top side of your piece. So I make sure to pick the better sides for the tops before I glue all this together. Another note is, since I wanted this at 2 inches thick, I ended up cutting all my pieces about a 2 1/8 to give me some room to plane all of this down. So as you clamp these together, it is going to pull them together sometimes in a twisted or cupped fashion on the edges. So I've learned that after having these 3 sections, I send them through my jointing jig once again, just to remove any undulations that were created while clamping. This kind of ensures a really nice clean seam there. You can see even before adding the clamps, there's hardly any gaps in those pieces. So now I have my 3 pieces and my 1 little strip, and I ended up gluing them together. So now I'm going to have only 3 seams, and the process for this is the same. I have them resting on pipe clamps. I can glue them all up, and then I'll add my cauls on either end to make sure this stays nice and flat. Then you could see here, even with all that preparation, planing and jointing and gluing it up in cauls, there's still some undulations towards the end, which is why I keep these substantially longer than they have to be. I'm trimming off a good 8 inches from either edge of these because the edges will always end up a little bit off. So these boards, I wanted a 5-foot top. I think I ended up making this 6 feet long and trimmed off 6 or 8 inches from either edge. And to do that, I just drew straight lines, and I have a worm drive skill saw which cuts really well and straight, so I just use that to trim off both sides following a straight line. Now once I have this cut, I pretty much sand this to finish sanding and then put it aside while I work on the base. So for that, I'm using a belt sander with 120 grit belt in there. You could start off pretty high on this because I really only have those 3 seams that are messed up. The other faces are already planed. So then I'll go through my orbital sander and really clean it up. But the nice thing about sending this through the planer again is while it's added time, it really cuts down on your sanding time. So since this is pine, I put it out of the way. I make sure to keep it on a mat because it will mar up pretty quickly since it is just pine. And then this is test fitting it on the tabletop, making sure that everything lines up. You could see how it overhangs now and cantilevers as well. And that's just a couple shots of the tabletop. And then at this point, I usually send a picture to the customer. I'll send some along the ways as well, just to make sure we're on the same page. And then what I also like to do, especially if you're planning on making this for someone else, is with the cutoffs of the butcher block, I make some stain samples for the top. So the top is being clear coated. People like to see what it's going to look like, so it's easy. I have a bunch of stuff laying around my shop. I make a couple pieces and put it on there. It's much easier to send some photos than to put something on there that the customer doesn't like. So then I'm using this MH Patch Ready stuff. It's kind of like spackle, but I think it's a little bit nicer than spackle. Even though this, I spent a lot of time planing all these boards, I have some dowel holes from the hardware, and it's I go through and patch all of those holes, and that stuff you could sand really easily. So I pretty much patch any sort of dent or hole and then sand it down. I'm putting this cover stain primer on there. Because this is pine, you might have an issue with bleed through and the tannins bleeding through on those knot holes. So I use a very heavy duty primer on the base because this stuff is supposed to help with any sort of tannin bleed through that you'll have on the base. So you only need one coat of this primer. I believe I ended up putting on 2. So then for the top coat, I'm putting on a higher end white enamel paint. I had this paint laying around. Someone gave me a bunch of paint a while ago and I happen to have this. I prefer to put some sort of enamel on stuff that's going in the kitchen, especially because you're going to get spills on it. It's going to get wet, and it's much easier to put a wet rag on enamel than it is other types of paints, basically because enamel will have some sort of resin or polymer in it, so it gives you a nice smooth, hard glass-like finish. Now the downside to that is it does have a glossy finish, but since this has such a huge tabletop, people don't love high gloss nowadays. You can't really tell that it is that high gloss finish. The other note about enamel is I painted this at this point at least a week ago and let it set around my shop because that enamel stays tacky for a very, very long time. You don't want to transport it super quickly after you paint it because you will mar it up. So we went with general finishes for the top side because it will give protection, and even though it's an ambering finish, which is a huge concern for people nowadays, first thing they ask me is, will it yellow? But the problem is if water-based finishes just aren't as durable for kitchen surfaces. I prefer oil pretty much all the time. I feel like general finishes is a nice compromise because it doesn't, in my experiences, yellow as much as other finishes, even though it is considered an ambering finish. So I already had refinished the bottom. This is the top side, and I don't show it in the video, but really big knot holes I had pre-filled and sanded with epoxy. And this is just a nice wiping urethane that you can just put on there. And when I did the bottom, I did the edge grain as well, so that edge grain is really going to soak up the finish. So by the time I finish this up, that edge grain will have at least 5 coats on it. So this stuff is great. You just wipe it on, very simple. It'll dry. I'll come back the next morning, sand it lightly, and put on another coat. And for the can, this says to put on 3 coats, but I usually put on more. So this is the next morning, and I'm lightly sanding the entire surface with 320 grit sandpaper. That first coat really soaks into the wood, so there's not much to do here. You're just knocking off any nurdles or undulations in the finish. Then I clear off all the dust and I recoat again. Like I said, this will probably take 3 or 4 coats. So then after the second coat, for the third coat, it's the exact same process, only I will switch the sandpaper from 320 to 600. By the time you get to the 4th coat, you're barely sanding and you're putting on a very thin skim coat on the top of the whole piece. The first coat and the second coat are the ones that take a lot of the finish into the wood. To save rags, I like to roll them up into the plastic glove I'm using so I could come back to them. I didn't show it in the video, but the way I attach this tabletop is I drill a hole because these aprons are so thick. I only want to use like 2.5-inch screws, and then I drill a smaller hole inside that. I put a washer on the end of a screw head, and then when that slides into the hole, it will go all the way up, and the tabletop can still move because that screw head can move within that washer. This is kind of the simplest way to do it. You can also buy hardware to attach these tabletops. And then this is not the finished piece. This is after the second coat. I wasn't going to have enough time to make the third and fourth coats into the video, but this is basically what the table looks like. It's really hard to get photos in my shop because it's so small, but sometimes I get lucky and the customer will send me a finished photo, and I update the thumbnail on these videos because it's easier to see. But that's basically what it looks like.